All right, let's go ahead and get started with step 5 of our business plan setup, which talks about our conversion rates. And you'll notice that we have two sets of 3 conversion rates, 3 conversion opportunities on the listing side, and those same 3 opportunities on the buyer side. And those 3 conversion opportunities are from an appointment to a buyer or seller agreement, and then the second is from that agreement to a property under contract, and the third opportunity is from a property under contract to a closed transaction. So let's go ahead and look at the listing side first. My first conversion opportunity is from a listing appointment to a listing taken. And we've got to make an assumption about what our typical conversion rate is going to be right there. Now, several factors will affect what your assumed conversion rate should be, but the most important factor is what type of appointment you're typically going to go on. And I'll give you an example. Let's say your typical listing appointment is either a direct referral or a direct business with someone in your sphere of influence. Your conversion rate will probably be reasonably high if you've got a good relationship with the people that you're typically going on these appointments for. And that may be somewhere in the 70, 80, maybe even upwards of 90% range if you're very good and polished on your listing presentation. However, if you go typically on what you might say are cooler listing appointments, like a for sale by owner, expired, or withdrawn seller appointments, your conversion rate will probably not be anywhere near as high, and that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. It's just the reality of the situation. So let's say in this case, I'll assume that I'm a primarily for sale by owner and expired seller listing agent, and I'm going to make an assumption that my typical conversion rate here is 15%. Meaning 15% of the time that I go on one of those listing appointments, I'll actually take that listing. Now, my second conversion opportunity is from the time I've taken that listing, what percentage of the time will that property ultimately go under contract? And I should be much better than 15% here. The biggest factor that will affect this conversion rate will be your ability to price properties appropriately and stand firm on that pricing, insisting that your sellers price properties within your local market price range. So I'm going to assume that I'm going to go ahead and stand pretty firm on insisting on good, solid pricing, getting my properties positioned where they need to be within the current local market. So I'm going to say 75% of the listings that I ultimately take are going to go under contract. Now, my final conversion opportunity is what percentage of those that go under contract will ultimately close. And we don't have quite as much control of that conversion on the seller side as we do when we're representing the buyer's agent, because typically we find that more often than not, when a transaction falls apart after going under contract, more often than not that happens on the buyer side, but we do have some control. So I'm going to assume here that I'm about 85% good, meaning 85% of the time when I get a listing under contract, I'm going to ultimately be able to carry that all the way to closing. Now, we've got the same 3 conversion opportunities on the buyer side. First of those is from a buyer appointment to a buyer representation agreement. And typically when we talk about buyer appointments, we're usually talking about a buyer coming into the office for an appointment, not meeting a buyer out at a house as a duty call or anything like that. Typically getting a buyer into the office gives us our maximum opportunity for conversion there. And I'm going to assume that I do a reasonably good job here. I'll say 70% of the time when I get someone to come and meet me in the office and I can deliver a good solid buyer consultation, I'm going to assume that 70% of the time I'm going to be able to convert that into a signed up represented buyer. So my second opportunity is from the time I've got that buyer representation agreement, whether or not I get that buyer ultimately under contract. And if I do a good job qualifying my buyer prospects, I'll probably get that buyer under contract, I'm going to assume 80% of the time. And here now I've got a little bit better control over what happens next than I would if I were on the seller side. Again, our third conversion opportunity is from the time I've got a buyer under contract with a property to the time we ultimately close a transaction. And since I've got really good tight control over this, and if my skills are really sharp and I'm really diligent and really working hard to bulletproof the transaction, I might be able to close 85, maybe even if I'm really talented, 90% of the properties that go under contract when I'm representing the buyer, might be able to close 85 or 90% of those transactions. So that's kind of how the conversion rates work. Again, make sure and have a look under these help balloons. They've got some more tips under what would make for, a good or an average conversion rate. And that's pretty much step 5, conversion rates.